The chamber was cold, its metallic walls bearing scars from battles long past, and the soldiers sat slumped against them as if they held him upright by force alone. His armor was battered, dented and spattered with mud that had dried into permanent stains, reminders of wars he no longer wished to recall. His name had once meant something on the front lines, whispered with both fear and respect, but now it echoed in silence, stripped of its weight. The exile was his punishment and solitude his sentence, a fate he accepted more easily than forgiveness. He had convinced himself that the galaxy was better off without him, and he without it. He counted time not by the days but by the endless cycle of light and darkness filtering through the jagged hole in the bunker. Each sunrise was a reminder that he had survived another night without purpose, and each sunset was a promise that he could drift into a void where nothing mattered. Food was scavenged sparingly from hidden caches left behind by retreating soldiers, while water came from condensation collected in broken machinery. He was not living, not really, but he refused to die either, caught between those states like an old weapon left to rust. That limbo was his penance, and he endured it silently. The silence broke on a morning when he heard footsteps, light, deliberate, and utterly foreign. They were not the heavy boots of fellow soldiers nor the clanking of machines, but something softer, purposeful. His first thought was that scavengers had come, others like him wandering the ruins in search of scraps. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his blade, the one weapon he hadn't abandoned. The rusted steel whispered as it slid free, though he doubted it would be enough to fend off a determined foe. Still, instinct was habit, and habit was survival. The figure that appeared in the doorway was not what he expected. She was tall, her skin a deep blue that caught the golden light of the rising sun, and her eyes glowed faintly with a hue that seemed alive. Adorned in fragments of ceremonial garb, she looked more like a phantom than flesh. Yet she carried herself with weight and intention. Behind her, others emerged, their forms near identical, their movements synchronized like shadows cast by the same flame. He blinked hard, unsure if hunger had finally driven him into hallucinations. But when they stepped fully into the chamber, the illusion became undeniable reality. The 5 women stood together, their gazes trained on him with unnerving steadiness. Each bore the markings of loss, etched not on their skin but in the way they carried themselves, shoulders squared not in pride but in defiance of grief. He could feel the grief radiating off them, sharp and raw like a wound that had never healed. They were not warriors by design, yet something about them carried the gravity of survivors. For the first time in years, he realized his solitude had been breached not by accident, but by intent. They had come here for him. He rose slowly, his armor groaning at the movement, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. The blade stayed at his side but ready, though part of him already sensed these beings did not come with malice. "Why are you here?" His voice rasped, dry from disuse, the words scraping out of his throat like gravel. None answered immediately, and the silence stretched until it felt like another weight pressing down on the bunker. Finally, the one who stood at the front stepped forward, her lips parting to form words in an accent foreign yet clear. "We need you." The simplicity of her statement struck him harder than any blade. He had not been needed in years, not since his last mission where everything had crumbled into fire and ash. He had been discarded as a liability, blamed for a failure that was not entirely his, and in that blame he had accepted the role of ghost. How these strangers dared to tell him otherwise, to demand something of the ruins of the man he once was. His jaw clenched, his gaze shifting between them, trying to decide if this was some cruel game the universe played on broken men. "You don't know what you're asking," he muttered. But they did know, or so it seemed. Each of the alien widows met his stare without flinching, their unity a wall he could not breach. They spoke then, one by one, their voices weaving a story of war that was not unlike his own. Their mates had been warriors, defenders of their people, cut down by invaders who sought not land or resources but domination for its own sake. The 5 who stood before him had survived not by valor but by exile, just as he had. Their kin were gone, their homes ash, their hopes pinned on finding someone who understood what it meant to lose everything. He wanted to laugh at the irony, though no humor found its way to his lips. The galaxy was wide, filled with countless species, countless warriors, and yet they had stumbled upon him, a man who had tried to erase himself from existence. He tried to tell them to leave, to seek someone whole, someone unbroken, but they refused to move. "You are the last we found," the leader said, her voice steady though pain swirled beneath it. "And if you turn us away, Then there will be no one. He felt the words wedge themselves into the hollow spaces of his chest where guilt and despair had long festered. His hand dropped from the blade, though he did not yet release it. He studied their faces, each one a mirror of sorrow, each one a plea disguised as strength. For a moment he saw in them a reflection of his own failure, but twisted into something else. A chance. He hated the idea of chances, of second lives and redemption, for he did not believe he deserved them. Yet the intensity in their eyes made him falter, made him remember what it felt like to have comrades who depended on him. He took a step closer, testing their resolve. They did not retreat. His voice softened, though the weariness never left it. "If I agree, what is it you expect of me?" The question hung heavy, and again it was the leader who answered. "We expect nothing you cannot give. We ask only that you stand with us, that you fight as you once did. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but for survival." Her words struck chords he had long tried to silence. Survival was all he had lived for, but always alone. To imagine survival shared was to imagine burden shared, and that was dangerous. Yet it stirred something long dormant in him, something that both terrified and intrigued. They came closer then, cautiously, as if he might vanish if they approached too quickly. He could smell the faint metallic tang of their skin, a reminder of a biology not his own, but alien did not mean incomprehensible. Loss smelled the same in every species. He could see their hands calloused from labor rather than combat, but steady nonetheless. These were not warriors who had chosen their path. These were survivors who had been forced onto it, and now they sought to drag him with them. Against every instinct, he found himself listening instead of rejecting. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. Not the silence of exile, but of choice. He could hear their breaths, the soft shifting of their feet, the unspoken hope hanging heavy in the air. For the first time in years, he was not utterly alone in that silence, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. His thoughts wrestled with themselves between the safety of solitude and the danger of belonging again. Belonging meant responsibility, and responsibility meant the risk of failing others once more. His heart recoiled, but his mind lingered. The soldier turned back to the doorway, the golden light spilling through it like the hand of fate itself. He imagined stepping out with them, imagined what it would mean to fight again, not for a banner, not for commanders who had abandoned him, but for 5 who had no one else. The idea was as heavy as his armor, and yet, for reasons he could not yet name, it did not crush him entirely. He dragged in a breath that rattled his ribs, tasting dust and sunlight alike. His hand finally released the blade, the metal clattering softly against the floor. It sounded like surrender, but not the kind he was used to. They did not cheer, did not smile, did not celebrate. They only nodded as if they had known this outcome before he himself had accepted it. Their calm unnerved him, yet also steadied him in ways he had not expected. He wondered if they truly understood what kind of man he was, what kind of failures he carried. But perhaps that was the point. They did not seek a hero, only someone who understood the burden of survival. His chest ached with something unfamiliar, something dangerously close to purpose. He resented it, but could not push it away. The chamber suddenly felt smaller, the walls tighter, as if they were pressing him outward. His exile had always felt like a coffin, a place where he had buried himself alive. Now these 5 strangers had torn the lid open, exposing him to light he had thought he could live without. He hated them for it, and yet part of him already knew he would follow them. He had always been a soldier. It was the one thing he knew how to be, even if it had destroyed him. Perhaps in the ashes of his ruin that role could still mean something. One of them, the youngest looking, though not the weakest, extended her hand toward him. Her fingers were long, tipped with subtle ridges, but her gesture was unmistakably universal. For a moment he stared, unsure whether to take it, unsure if he even remembered how. Slowly he raised his own, scarred and calloused, and placed it into hers. The warmth surprised him. He had expected alien coldness, but instead it was solid, grounding. It was a grip not of command, but of solidarity, and it anchored him in ways he could not explain. As their hands met, he felt the weight of years begin to shift, not vanishing but redistributing. His past did not vanish, but for the first time in years it did not feel like his alone to carry. He looked into their eyes again, saw the shared fire of grief, and realized that perhaps grief could be a forge as much as it was a chain. He did not know if he could live up to what they sought, but he knew he could no longer return to the silence. His choice was made. even if the path ahead was still shrouded in shadow. The widows turned together, their movement fluid, a silent invitation for him to follow. He hesitated, glancing once more at the battered chamber that had been his prison and his refuge. It looked smaller now, almost laughably so, a relic of a life he no longer wished to claim. With a heavy exhale, he stepped forward, his boots crunching against debris, his armor creaking with reluctant resolve. The air outside struck his face, warm and sharp, alive with the scent of earth and ash. For the first time in years, the world beyond exile felt real. As he emerged from the bunker, the light struck him fully, washing away the shadows that had clung to his armor. The 5 widows waited, forming a silent phalanx of resilience, their eyes steady upon him. He knew nothing of their world, nothing of their customs, nothing of the war they carried in their veins. But he knew the language of survival, and that would have to be enough for now. His body was heavy, his soul heavier still, but his steps did not falter. The exile was over, though he could not yet decide if that meant salvation or damnation. They moved as one, their formation protective without being possessive, guiding him into a future he could not yet see. He realized then that perhaps he had not been chosen at random. Perhaps fate was crueler or kinder than he understood. In their presence, his silence cracked, his walls weakened, and his purpose, though fragile, was beginning to take root. He did not know what battles awaited, what enemies would rise, or whether he would survive long enough to matter. But as he walked beside them for the first time in years, he was no longer walking alone. And though he would not yet admit it aloud, that alone was enough to ignite the faintest ember of hope in the ashes of his broken soul. Chapter 1 is done. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 2 now? The ruins stretched beyond the horizon, jagged silhouettes of a civilization reduced to rubble by merciless fire. The soldier walked among them with the widows at his side, each step pulling him further from the tomb he had built for himself. The sun was merciless overhead, beating down on cracked stone and twisted metal, but it was not the heat that weighed on him. It was the stares of the women. Their silence was not cold but filled with expectation, as if every breath he took was a prelude to something more. He wondered if they knew just how fractured he truly was inside. They led him through what had once been a plaza, now just a graveyard of shattered monuments. The remnants of carved statues lay scattered, their once proud features eroded and broken. He thought of his own face, scarred and weathered, barely resembling the man he had once been. The widows walked with heads high, unflinching in the shadow of their people's ruins. He envied them in that moment, their ability to endure without collapsing under the weight of memory. His own memories still bled like open wounds. He almost asked why they had chosen him, but the answer lingered in the way they looked at him, because no one else remained. The leader, whose voice had first broken his silence, finally spoke again as they climbed over debris. You carry scars, so do we. That is why we sought you. Her words were simple, stripped of poetry, but they rang louder than the distant wind. He almost told her that scars did not make him strong, that they made him dangerous to those who depended on him. Yet her calm eyes silenced his protest. She was not asking him to be invincible, only present. The request felt heavier than any command he had ever followed. They reached a structure that still stood, its skeletal frame cracked but intact. Inside, the air was cool, carrying a faint tang of herbs. It was a shelter carefully tended with woven mats on the floor and vessels of water lined against the wall. He realized then that they had been living here, holding on to this fragile sanctuary amid desolation. His chest tightened as he saw the effort it must have taken, the resilience in their every choice. These women were not merely survivors, they were builders clinging to hope with bloodied fingers. He lowered himself to sit, feeling unworthy to share their space. One of the widows placed a bowl before him, filled with a broth that smelled both foreign and inviting. He hesitated, glancing at her as if expecting a trick, but her expression was steady, expectant. Hunger gnawed at him despite his pride, and he lifted the bowl, drinking slowly. The warmth spread through him, alien yet comforting, as though the liquid itself insisted on keeping him alive. He had not tasted kindness in years, and it unnerved him more than any enemy blade. He set the bowl down, but the taste lingered, unsettling and grounding all at once. As night fell, the widows lit dim orbs that glowed with soft light, filling the chamber with a glow like starlight. They sat in a circle, and though they did not invite him outright, he felt the weight of their silent inclusion. Reluctantly, he joined them, folding his legs with the creak of armor that had seen too many wars. One widow began to hum, low and mournful, a sound that vibrated in the hollow of his chest. It was not a song of beauty but of memory, of lives lost and bonds severed. The others joined, and together they wove sorrow into harmony. He closed his eyes despite himself, letting the sound fill cracks he had long ignored. When the hum ended, silence returned, heavy and sacred. He found himself speaking without meaning to, his voice low, confessing pieces of his past. He told them of battles that had turned to disasters, of comrades who had trusted him and fallen anyway, of the betrayal that left him cast aside. He did not embellish nor seek pity. He only spoke as though spilling poison from a wound. To his surprise, they did not recoil. They listened steady and still, their eyes holding neither judgment nor disbelief. For the first time, he wondered if they might understand more than he imagined. The youngest widow leaned forward then, her voice quiet but sharp. "You think you are cursed. We think you are chosen." The words struck him like a hammer, making him scoff, though no humor reached his lips. He wanted to argue, to demand why anyone would choose him after what he had done, but her gaze pierced through him unflinching until his protest withered on his tongue. Chosen for what he did not know. Yet the word lingered in the chamber, echoing in his bones long after she fell silent. That night he could not sleep. He lay on the woven mat, staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks that seemed to form constellations of a sky he no longer believed in. The widows rested nearby, their breathing slow and even, but he could not join them in peace. His mind was too loud, replaying their words, their gazes, their unwavering belief. He had once lived for orders, for structure, for the clarity of command. Now he faced something more dangerous than command. Trust freely given. Trust he feared he would only shatter. Morning came with the sound of distant thunder, though the skies were clear. One of the widows explained it was not weather but machines. War machines still prowling the edges of their broken world. His body tensed at the word, memories of steel and fire clawing at him. They had survived by hiding, by avoiding those monsters, but even their caution could not last forever. The soldier understood this better than most. No war allowed anyone to remain untouched. "They will come here eventually," he said flatly, earning nods from the women. They already knew. He rose, joints stiff but mind sharper than it had been in years. He studied the structure, the ruins around it, the pathways and vantage points. Instinct returned like an old ghost, whispering strategies, defenses, traps. He had buried that part of himself, convinced it served no purpose in solitude, but here it surged forth unbidden. The widows watched him pace, his eyes scanning every angle, every weakness. For the first time, he did not resist the voice of the soldier inside him. For the first time, he let it speak. By midday, he had sketched crude plans into the dust, showing them how to turn rubble into barricades, how to use narrow alleys to funnel enemies, how to set traps that required no weapons but cunning. The widows leaned close, absorbing every word, their sharp minds latching onto his teachings with startling ease. They asked questions, few but precise, and he answered without hesitation. It felt strange, almost alien, to have listeners who valued his knowledge instead of condemning it. With every word, the old fire in him flared brighter, though he feared its heat. When one widow returned carrying scavenged metal, he taught her how to sharpen it into a blade. Another brought cords of sinew, and he showed her how to string traps with deadly efficiency. By the time the sun dipped low again, the ruins around their shelter had transformed subtly, still broken but now watchful, armed with hidden dangers for intruders. The widows moved with new purpose, their grief reshaped into resolve. Watching them stirred something deep in him, something he could not yet name. They were not soldiers, but with his guidance they could become a force the machines would not expect. That night he ate with them again, the broth thicker, richer, as if they had saved the best for this moment. He wanted to ask why they trusted him so quickly, but the question lodged in his throat. Perhaps they saw something in him he could not. Perhaps they had no other choice. Regardless, the trust felt like both a gift and a weight, pressing against his chest until he could barely breathe. Yet he did not walk away. He stayed, listening to their quiet voices, watching their eyes that glimmered with stubborn light. When sleep came this time, it was shallow but unbroken. He dreamed of fire, but also of hands reaching through it, pulling him forward instead of pushing him back. He awoke sweating, his hand gripping his blade, but the widow's presence grounded him. They were still there, breathing, real, unshaken. For the first time, he did not dread the dawn. For the first time, he welcomed it. By the third morning, he had become a part of their rhythm without realizing it. He helped gather water, scouted the perimeter, shared small fragments of his knowledge. He no longer felt like a ghost haunting ruins. He felt tethered, fragile, but real. Each widow bore her grief differently, one in silence, one in songs, one in endless questions, one in careful gestures, and the leader in unyielding resolve. Together they formed something he could not quite define. Not a unit, not a family, but something alive enough to make him wonder if belonging was possible again. As they prepared for another day, the leader placed a hand on his arm, her grip firm. "When they come, we will stand. With you." The certainty in her voice left no room for doubt, no space for retreat. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, torn between fear and something dangerously close to pride. He had once been abandoned by his commanders, by his comrades, left to rot in exile. But here, among the widows of another world, he felt a truth he had thought forever lost. He was not alone, and that realization frightened him more than any battle ever could. Chapter 2 complete. Do you want me to go ahead with Chapter 3? The third dawn rose blood red, staining the sky as though the world itself remembered its wounds. The soldier stood at the edge of the ruins, scanning the horizon with a gaze sharpened by instinct. The widows moved behind him in silence, their steps measured, their breath steady. He had taught them to remain quiet, to blend into the bones of their broken city, and they had learned quickly. The city was no longer just a graveyard. It was a battlefield waiting to be awakened. The soldier felt his pulse quicken, the old rhythm of anticipation stirring within his chest. He crouched near the edge of a collapsed wall, tracing the dust with his finger as he outlined where the machines would come. He explained their patterns, the way metal monsters always moved with grinding precision, unthinking but predictable. The widows watched his hand, memorizing the shapes, their eyes reflecting the morning light with alien intensity. They asked no unnecessary questions, and he gave no unnecessary words. This was not about speeches or oaths. This was survival carved into stone. The ruins would become their shield and, if need be, their weapon. The leader, whose name he now knew as Soraya, stepped closer, her voice firm. "We will fight as one. You must believe that." He looked at her, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his scars. Belief was a luxury he had long discarded. Yet her conviction was so unshakable it pressed against his doubts like a blade at his throat. He gave a curt nod, not a promise, but an acknowledgement, the best he could offer. She accepted it without protest, as though she understood belief would come only in action, not in words. The widows had adapted quickly to his training, but the soldier knew knowledge was no substitute for bloodshed. War had a way of stripping illusions away, leaving only what was real. He feared what they would see in themselves once the machines came, whether they would endure or shatter. Yet he also feared what he might see in himself, dragged once more into the cycle of violence he had tried to escape. He told himself it was only temporary, only until the threat passed. But deep down, he already sensed the lie in those thoughts. At midday they heard it, the distant rumble of steel on stone, the grinding of gears that shook the air like thunder. The soldier tensed, muscles coiled as memories of countless battlefields surged through him. The widows gathered, eyes wide but unflinching, their breath quickened but steady. He motioned for silence, raising a hand, and they obeyed instantly. The sound grew louder, closer, until the ruins themselves seemed to vibrate with the weight of approaching death. His heart hammered, not from fear but from the familiar rhythm of a soldier preparing to fight. When the machines emerged, they were as he had remembered, towering constructs of metal, their limbs moving with relentless precision, their eyes glowing with cruel light. There were 3 of them, patrol units meant to scour survivors from the ashes. Their weapons gleamed in the sun, spitting sparks as they scanned the ruins. The soldier pressed himself into shadow, the widows following his lead, their bodies taut with tension. He whispered instructions in short, sharp phrases, each one a command sharpened into survival. They listened, their focus unbroken. Together they became part of the ruins, unseen but waiting. The first trap triggered with a snap, rubble collapsing onto one of the machines. The soldier had rigged it to look accidental, but the force of falling stones staggered the metal beast, leaving its glowing eye exposed. Without hesitation, one widow hurled the sharpened shard of metal he had given her, and it struck true. Sparks flew as the machine screeched, flailing before collapsing under its own weight. The sound echoed across the ruins, a cry of dying metal. The widows flinched at the violence, but their resolve did not break. They had drawn first blood. The remaining machines turned, their sensors whirring, searching for the source of the attack. The soldier moved like a shadow, signaling the widows to scatter into positions they had practiced. He darted forward, blade in hand, using the ruins for cover. Every movement was instinct, every breath calculated. The widows followed suit, their alien grace blending with his ruthless precision. For a moment he almost forgot they were untrained. So fluid was their execution. He felt something dangerous stir within him. Pride. The second machine lumbered into a narrow alley just as he had predicted. As its heavy frame scraped through, ropes tightened and beams collapsed, pinning it in place. Soraya leapt from above, her makeshift spear plunging into exposed circuitry, sparks exploding around her. The machine shrieked, its limbs thrashing wildly, but she held firm, her face set in fierce determination. The soldier moved to her side, driving his blade deep into its chest, finishing the kill. Together they watched the light fade from its eye. Victory carved into silence. He glanced at her, surprised by her ferocity. She met his gaze, unyielding. The last machine roared, its sensors locking onto them. It fired, beams of searing light slicing through stone, the heat blistering the air. The soldier shoved Soraya aside, the blast grazing his armor, scorching the metal but sparing his flesh. Pain flared, but he ignored it, charging forward with reckless precision. The widows swarmed from the shadows, striking from every angle, their weapons crude but effective. The machine flailed, surrounded, its strength useless against their unity. The soldier climbed onto its back, driving his blade into the core, ripping wires free with a roar. The machine convulsed, then collapsed in a storm of sparks. Silence returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal. The widows stood panting, their bodies slick with sweat, their eyes wide with the shock of survival. The soldier pulled his blade free, his chest heaving, his heart pounding with an energy he had not felt in years. He looked at them, not as survivors, not as strangers, but as comrades. They had fought and they had endured. For the first time, he felt the weight of possibility, the fragile but undeniable truth that they might actually stand a chance. Soraya approached him, her face streaked with soot, her eyes burning with fierce light. "We stood," she said simply, her voice steady despite the tremor of exhaustion. He stared at her, words caught in his throat, and only managed a nod. The others gathered, their faces reflecting both fear and exhilaration, their breaths mingling in the air. They had faced death together, and together they had emerged. That bond, forged in fire, could not be easily broken. He felt it settling into him, heavy yet grounding. He was no longer just an exile. He was a soldier again. That night they built a fire, small but bright, its flames dancing against the broken stone. The widows sat close, their bodies pressed together, their voices soft with whispered prayers and songs of mourning. The soldier sat apart at first, staring into the flames, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He had fought again, killed again, and instead of the emptiness he expected, he felt alive. It terrified him. He wanted to retreat into silence, to smother the fire before it consumed him. But then Soraya's hand touched his arm, steady and grounding, pulling him back from the edge.